Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. It's very nice to see such a large crowd on a cold winter night. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Paul Roth. I'm the director of the Image Center at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I really appreciate you all joining us tonight for the latest in our Howard and Carol Tanenbaum lecture series. We're really pleased to have with us tonight someone who is both a wonderful person, in my opinion, and also an important contributor to the universe of photography for many, many years. Kristen Lubben, Executive Director of the Magnum Foundation. TMU, where we're gathered tonight, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We embrace the responsibility that we've inherited from the generations that have come before us to express care for this land and also all the many people who make their homes here or come as visitors. Now, before we start, I'd like to address briefly the historic context for the Tanenbaum Lecture Series, because this is our oldest and most important program about photography. The series was, for most of its history, known as the Kodak Lecture Series, and many people in this audience attended lectures in the Kodak Lecture Series as long ago as decades and decades. It was called the Kodak Lecture Series because for most of its history, it was sponsored by Kodak Canada. Long before we took over responsibility for the series here at the Image Center, it was hosted by educators in TMU's School of Image Arts, then of course known as Ryerson School of Image Arts. Over more than 50 years now, we've welcomed nearly 250 photographers, filmmakers, media artists, photo historians, and curators who came to address Toronto audiences about their work, including the very first speaker, the legendary photojournalist W. Eugene Smith. I'm happy to say I know at least a couple of people in this audience were here for that very first lecture. When the Image Center opened its doors in 2012, we inherited the acclaimed lecture series from our colleagues, and we are very fortunate that we did so because for us it's been a privilege to continue presenting it. Right from the beginning, when the Image Center opened in 2012, two of our most devoted supporters, Howard and Carol Tanenbaum, who are great collectors of photography and long devoted to the medium of photography more generally, agreed to underwrite the series so that it could continue even after Kodak faded into the sunset. We're very grateful to Howard and Carol for their long support of the Image Center and, of course, this important lecture series. And while they're not able to be here tonight, I know that they would join me in welcoming all of you. I also want to take a moment to thank the Ontario Arts Council, which supports our exhibitions, programs, all of our operations in general. The OAC does so much to support the arts in Ontario, and we are very happy to be among their grantees. Now, before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple pieces of housekeeping, so to speak. First, we are recording tonight's program so that we can post it to our YouTube channel for those who aren't able to attend in person. And this is important because after the discussion, Kristen will be taking questions from the audience, and some of you may have questions that you want to ask. I would only ask you to please wait until we can bring a microphone to you. You simply raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone, and that way we can capture your question as well as Kristen's answer on the recording. And now let me tell you a little bit about Kristen. Kristen is a curator, writer, and editor whose work explores intersections of photography, art, and politics. Prior to joining the Magnum Foundation as its first executive director in 2016, Kristen was one of the amazing roster of curators who worked at the International Center of Photography, or ICP, in New York. And this is where I first came to know Kristen, as she and I were about the same age and about the same place in our careers. And my museum, at that time, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, would sometimes collaborate with her museum to present exhibitions. And we gravitated toward each other while we, of course, were working together on coordinating details. I very quickly came to admire Kristen and her principled, thoughtful take on things, and also the unique way that she organized exhibitions. And over the years, I have learned a lot from her shows and from her books. Kristen curated numerous exhibitions while at ICP and assisted on many more, far too many to detail, but I will mention that she worked on a couple of the of the ICP's influential triennials of contemporary photography and video. She organized the great survey Susan Meiselas in history. She organized Magnum Contact Sheets, which I imagine many of you have seen or at least saw the book for. And a show that has been very important to me in my career, Image and Icon, which focused on images of Amelia Earhart. For me, really a groundbreaking show in opening up how I thought about photography and the subject. In tonight's lecture, Kristen will explore the intersection between photography, archives, and public memory. And she will also discuss the work of the organization that she leads, the Magnum Foundation, which supports creativity and innovation in documentary photography. This lecture is, as many of you know, presented in conjunction with the exhibitions that we have on view at the Image Center now, Magnum's First and Chim's Children of Europe, which bring focus to the early history of Magnum photos. I hope that you've had a chance to see these shows at the Image Center, or if you haven't, that you will see them after this lecture. We're so happy to welcome Kristen Lubben to the Image Center and to Toronto.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that very warm welcome and reminder of our long shared history. It's such an honor to be here and a pleasure to be among people who I know are really interested in photography and photo history, if you're willing to turn out on such a cold night. And I was especially interested in the invitation to come and talk about Magnum's First in this context because the invitation to weave together a presentation of the work of the Magnum Foundation, which is mostly actually very future-oriented and engaged with supporting younger photographers and next generation of photographers, also has very deep roots in Magnum history and the history of collective projects that Magnum grows out of. And so thinking about Magnum's First and the ways that that archive of Magnum was how you chose to do an exhibition of Magnum history was really interesting to me. And in some ways is sort of alluding to what Paul's talking about our shared approach to photographic history, which is less interested in, let's do a show of the greatest hits of Magnum's history, and more, how has Magnum told its own history? How have these archives created a narrative about itself? So I thought it was very interesting that you chose to do that exhibition as your Magnum exhibition. I love the crate in the exhibition, the materiality of it, because again, it's less about just seeing the great pictures and more about how do these histories get told, how do they get mobilized, and what use are they put to at different moments in time. So I'll move on from our logo. So what I don't want to do is actually just give you a total overview of the work of the Magnum Foundation, because we do many, many different things, and I'll get lost in the weeds of all the different programs that we do, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them. But I would like to try to tie together, again, this roots in history and engagement with history and archives and what it means to be photographing in the present and to be supporting photographers to be photographing now. So the image that you're looking at here is a snapshot of some of the work that we supported in 2025. In that year alone, we supported 95 photographers from 34 different countries whose projects document fights for democracy and equality, uplift joy and resistance and community at the margins, and shed light on human rights abuses worldwide. So we do a sort of little snapshot at the end of every year, kind of summarizing some of the work that we do. And again, as I said, I'm not going to get into all of the projects, but I'll point to a few of them as we go and look more closely at actually the founding of the Magnum Foundation almost 20 years ago, and the ways that it's been an incubator of new ideas, and also drawing on the deep history of Magnum and its collective spirit. So just a little bit of background, almost like an organizational bio about Magnum Foundation, like Paul did a bio of me. The Magnum Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in New York City. So we sort of run and operate parallel to Magnum Photos. We're not a subsidiary thereof, but we were founded by the photographers of Magnum Photos. But we're a New York-based, independent nonprofit organization. That said, we have a lot of interflow with the Magnum community, and we're very much a part of the community. Half of our board are Magnum photographers. Susan Meiselas, who spoke earlier in this lecture series, is our president, and we have a shared history and ethos. Many Magnum photographers are mentors in our programs, as well as participants in our programs. So we're based in the East Village in New York, and we support a global network of photographers. If you're in New York, please come and visit us. So again, I mentioned I wanted to say a little bit about the founding of the Magnum Foundation, which was interesting for me to go back to, actually, because I wasn't at the Magnum Foundation then, though I was at the founding of it. As it turned out, I found this picture just a few days ago because I was trying to find a picture of the event at which the idea of the Magnum Foundation was hatched. And the idea was first pitched at the 60th anniversary of Magnum Photos in 2007. Those of you who know Magnum well know that every year they have an annual general meeting where all of the photographers get together. It's sort of a legendary convening, and it's been going on since the very beginning. And they always take pictures, and they also always bring these photographs of the founders and have them propped up at the AGM, which I think is funny. And one thing I loved about your exhibitions, I don't know if this is Gail or Paul, but that you actually acknowledged there wasn't 4 members, that there weren't 4 founders, there were more than that. But the photographers have culled it down to this group. But very importantly, Maria Eisner, who was the amazing photo editor, was also key to the founding of Magnum, though she doesn't get a portrait here, as were Bill and Rita Vandevert. So anyway, I shout out to you guys for telling a fuller story. But anyway, I digress there. But so this photograph was actually taken in the MoMA Sculpture Garden, and this is a celebration of their 60th anniversary. The photograph was taken by Martin Parr, who just died recently, a huge loss for our community. The woman speaking in red is Martine Franck, and there are many of the Magnum photographers there. Bert Glynn in the front, Eli Reed must be standing on a chair or something. He's big, but not actually that big. Alex Soth is there in the front. And then, to my surprise, that's actually me in the gray pants standing behind Martine. I didn't know, I didn't remember being there, but it was a long time ago, which, again, is a funny little side note, but also in a way indicates, I think, a bigger issue, which is that there is this community of documentary practice that is interwoven and includes Magnum Foundation, and an extended network of curators, photo editors. You know, I would put, Paul mentioned that we've had at this point, decades-long dialogue about these issues of documentary photography. So I think this notion of the collective that is Magnum Photos is surrounded by rings of other collectives and collaborations. And again, ICP, where I was for 17 years before joining the Magnum Foundation, is also, to a certain degree, an outgrowth of Magnum Photos. So ICP was founded by Cornell Capa, founded after the death of his brother Robert Capa, Werner Bischoff, and Shim, who's the other artist who's on view downstairs, to recognize and celebrate the tradition of concerned photography, as he called it, documentary practice in the service of social change, social good, and a recognition that other museums weren't acknowledging this form of photography at the time, and that if there wasn't an institution that recognized it and celebrated it, this work could be lost. And so Cornell, who was a photographer and a member of Magnum himself, started first something called the Fund for Concerned Photography, which then turned into ICP. And the ICP still has the archives of Robert and Cornell Capa, as well as Gerda Taro, So again, there's just this weaving together of this extended community, which feels important to me, especially being here, where I feel like the Image Center, in some ways, with the Black Star Collection and the shows that you do, we were just talking about this, feels like part of that extended network of those of us in dialogue about these issues. This was actually, I also just found this a few days ago. So this has been fun for me to go back to this moment of what were the photographers thinking when they founded the Magnum Foundation, which at this point, has grown in a very organic way to do many different things. But this is an image of the first brochure that they did, continuing the tradition of photography working in the public interest, and a quote by Cartier-Bresson. Interestingly, I think you could say, again, this is the lineage within Magnum that is referred to as concerned photography, which is a strong strain within Magnum, but actually Magnum has always contained a lot of different strains, and this is sort of just one of them. I think you could say that Martin Parr, or even Cartier-Bresson, or many others, many of the younger photographers, show that it's actually a big umbrella that contains a lot of different things, but this was really the spirit with which the Magnum Foundation was started. So again, it was initiated by the photographers of Magnum Photos, really with an idea that the collective itself couldn't keep expanding to support all of the photographers that they wanted to support, but also to keep responding to what it meant to be supporting independent long-form documentary practice in a very changed media environment. So the ways that photographers were able to work, certainly with the big funding of the big picture magazines in the 50s, 60s, and then in the 70s, being able to work independently, but on spec, the way that Susan was able to do, had really collapsed by this point. And there were conversations within Magnum about how is the next generation actually going to be able to get started in this landscape where magazines, newspapers are not paying people enough to go out there and do the kind of work that an earlier generation was able to do. So the idea of the foundation was both to support a next generation, embrace other kinds of work that was otherwise hard to fund or maybe wouldn't naturally live in a magazine but was interesting in pushing the field forward, and also to look at the history of documentary practice. So a couple of the projects that I was looking at in the early days of the Magnum Foundation that I thought were really interesting and breaking new ground. And again, I was watching a little bit from a distance, but very close with Susan. As Paul said, I did her retrospective, which, by the way, he wrote a wonderful review of at the time, and a number of other exhibitions with Magnum photographers. But so I was sort of watching what the foundation was doing. It was really interesting because I think you would think from its name, or I would have, the Magnum Foundation, they must just be preserving Magnum history and doing exhibitions from Magnum histories, Magnum's archives, right? And so while we do some of that, there is actually a much more kind of experimental initiative, kind of almost a space for innovation and R&D in documentary practice in some ways. And so you can see that in a project like this, which was by photographer Emily Schiffer, and it started with the work that's on the left. So this was a project from 2011 where the foundation was giving grants to young photographers. This was one of the Inga Morath Foundation grants, so given in the name of the Magnum photographer Inga Morath to support young female photographers doing reportage, long-form work. And so this is a story about food deserts in Chicago and people who were growing their own food in the city. And it ran in Mother Jones, which I don't know if you get here, is American leftist magazine. And Emily and the people she was working with were sort of frustrated that it, in magazine form, it kind of did one thing, but it also reached the audience that you would think it would reach. It didn't reach the people that were in the pictures. And so she came up with this idea with somebody named Orrin Williams at the Center for Urban Transformation in Chicago's South Side that used documentary photography to strengthen community-based initiatives around this issue. So they installed photography around the city in different places, and it was linked to a call for citizens to reach out to their local representatives to get funding for initiatives that would address the issues that the work was describing. And so this was a Magnum Foundation supported project, and I thought it was very interesting the way that the foundation and Susan and the other people working with her were starting with things that were more conventional reportage, but by younger, newer photographers that you may not have heard of, but then thinking about how can they go beyond the magazine page, how can they go beyond the photo essay and mobilize communities in a different way. Another one of these was Matt Black's Geography of Poverty. Matt Black is actually now a Magnum photographer. He actually just won the MacArthur this year, but he was first Magnum Foundation grantee, and he did this amazing project looking at poverty throughout the United States, and photographing, but also doing an Instagram project, which now doesn't sound so exciting, but at the time was pretty innovative, and getting feedback and exchange from people along the route, and also did this big project on MSNBC. And this was a sort of an early experiment with trying to, again, get off the printed page and think about the different possibilities for sharing work with a larger audience, with an interactive audience, bringing photography into new spaces. And then this also wound up as a public art installation in New York City in 2015 at St. John the Divine, street facing, and a book in 2018. And then I think one of the moments when I really thought this is something interesting is going on here was this is an issue of Aperture magazine called Documentary Expanded, which was a partnership with the Magnum Foundation. Susan was the guest editor, and it was also tied with a symposium and a series of workshops for photographers. And it was really about the expanding terrain of documentary. So projects like the two that I just showed of getting photography off the page and into engaging audiences in new ways, but also thinking about working in the space of new technology. So, with the decline of conventional media support for documentary photography, are there ways that we can actually make use of the new technologies in interesting ways? And can this kind of work be expanded in that way? So there were both projects and writers in this issue that were thinking about both new theoretical frameworks like Ariella Azulay and Nato Thompson, as well as a number of people working in the space of new technologies. And it was very unique at the time because, again, this is 2014. I remember, I don't know where you were at the time, but at ICP and in other photography spaces, everybody knew that this was changing the landscape of photography, of documentary photography, but how to grapple with it, how to create dialogue and discourse around it, and the way that the foundation could act very quickly and say, this is interesting, let's do it, and pull something together very quickly, and all of the most interesting people were there. There was a convening for 500 people. It felt like, okay, this is where new ideas are being baked up, which was very exciting. And that's when I, after 17 years, decided to leave ICP for various reasons, but also because this just felt like a really exciting, interesting space to be in, both thinking about the future of documentary photography, but also supporting photographers, which is quite exciting as, a curator who doesn't actually get to do that. You get to just, when the work is done, decide if you like it or not. To be able to be supporting it at an early stage is really quite thrilling. And also to be seeing so much new work all the time. So this was, in response to that, this is a poster that I did at the end of my first year at the Magnum Foundation because I was so excited by, this is one image by everybody we supported that year. And I think to me, looking back on it again, it represents that the excitement and almost wonder of like, there's so much incredible work out there that people don't know about from all around the world. People doing incredible projects, and with just a small amount of seed funding, sometimes it's, $3,000, $5,000, a project can go from being just an idea to being actualized and being out there in the world, which is really thrilling. And this was one of the first experiences with that, and this is a photographer that I've continued to work with and be in touch with throughout my time at the Magnum Foundation. Eric Yamfi from Ghana. If you don't know his work, I encourage you to look it up. Mark Seeley has also shown it at Autograph. Beautiful work, and this was a project that came in that first round of grant making that I saw a super young Ghanaian photographer photographing his queer community in Ghana, and with this tenderness and this beauty, and also showing what it looks like to be photographing a community from within, pictures that you would not get if you were not friends with these people and living alongside them. So seeing both, he described this as something that he assumed would just sort of stay under his pillow and never get realized because he didn't know who would support this work. And so to be able, with a small grant, to make this possible and turned into a great body of work. And again, we've continued to work together over many years, and the work has been shown in a lot of places. It's very gratifying, and I think also a little bit of a proof of concept of, that there are just so many stories out there, and with a little bit of interconnection between people and support, very cool things can happen. And then at the other span, these were both on that poster, of the other end of the kind of work that Magnum Foundation was doing. This is a book called Europa, and Thomas Dvorak, who's a Magnum photographer, was behind this along with a number of other Magnum photographers and partners. And the idea behind Europa was that this was in the height of the refugee crisis in Europe, and people fleeing Syria and elsewhere, and Europe contending with what to do with all of these refugees. And there were all these pictures in the newspaper of, the abandoned vest, and of, people who were making the migration by boat. And there was this glut of, I think, documentary photography, photo reportage that all looked quite similar, taking pictures of these people, but not in some ways, did those pictures change anything? Thomas's question to himself and his colleagues was, what if documentary photographers thought instead about how our photography can be useful to these people? Rather than take pictures to show somebody else, can we do something that's actually functionally useful to these people? And so he came up with this idea, which is basically a guidebook, a practical guide for refugees. So it pulls together photographs from the Magnum archives about prior waves of immigration to Europe, practical information about what a pharmacy looks like, where to get your health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And it was never sold. It was only handed out free of charge at refugee centers. And so I thought it was a really cool, both practically useful item, but also a challenge, like, what is documentary photography for? When we're photographing people in extreme circumstances, are we thinking about how it serves them? So I'm going to jump a little bit back in time and talk about some of my earlier engagements with Magnum Photos, which have informed the work that I'm now doing at the foundation. Paul mentioned this book, Magnum Contact Sheets, which is sort of a monster of a book. Just physically, it's quite large. And Martin Parr was actually our partner in doing this book. He was an amazing, amazing person to work with, both because he had every picture, it seemed, in his head and could pull it up. Just, what about this one? I'd love to see the contact for that picture. I bet it's interesting. But also just this sense of what it meant to be doing a project about contact sheets at that moment. This was published in 2011. So it was really at the moment when, this was becoming a historic process, and digital was really taking over. So contact sheets were going from being a real working tool in the Magnum offices to feeling like a historic artifact. So that's when we did this book. And the picture that you see on the right is Henri Cartier-Bresson, and you see him looking at contact sheets. And he famously wouldn't show people his contact sheets and actually cut them up. So there's a quote in the book that I'm going to butcher, but something about them being like toenails that you need to cut. They need to be trimmed and pruned, that you don't show anybody the unedited version, but that they need to be culled. And he also was very insistent upon seeing anybody who wanted to join Magnum, seeing their contact sheets, because you could tell from the contact sheets whether somebody was actually a good photographer, right? Because you can see, did they just have one good shot in 50 rolls, or do they, like Joseph Kudelka, which I think I'm not showing here, but there's a picture in the book from his Soviet invasion of Prague where you see, it's like 6 or 7 of his most famous pictures all on one roll of film. It's pretty incredible. Working anonymously at the time as Prague photographer. So I just bring this in because I think it's thinking about Magnum history, and again, the ways that Magnum has told its own history, but also the things that you can find in photographic archives that maybe weren't interesting at the time, but become interesting over time. This is an image of Gilles Perez' Bloody Sunday, 1972, in Derry, the killing of 13 protesters by British troops. And I find this interesting to come back to now because this contact sheet in his work was used in many of the court cases trying to figure out and place blame for these killings, and sort of reminded me of what's going on, particularly in the US right now, with citizen journalism and videos where people documenting these killings, such as we just had in Minneapolis, you're following the frame by frame of that moment. And this work was used in the inquiries into this event. But he also had concerns at the time about turning over his contact sheets because he was aware that you could identify faces in the crowd. And that's another thing we're dealing with now as we think about photographing, protest, and photography as witnessing. Another Magnum-related project at ICP was this exhibition of Gerda Taro's work. And I brought this in because, like contact sheets, it's also about sort of the hidden archive that can be resurfaced. Taro's work was not well known for many, many years. And in fact, the story at ICP was that it was hidden, or not hidden, but put under Cornell's bed in boxes for years. And this was an exhibition in 2007, which I worked on with Richard Whalen, who was Robert Capa's biographer, and Irma Schaber, who is Taro's biographer. And the two images on the right, I think, are kind of interesting because they show some of the archival material that reveals a more complex story than, one of the first female war photographers killed in battle in the Spanish Civil War, girlfriend of Robert Capa. It's a very sort of a romantic but story that gets reduced. And what's kind of interesting on the material on the side, you see this reportage Capa and Taro, which was a stamp that they used to pitch their work collectively during a certain period. And so to me, it's interesting to think about that idea of working collectively and, as a strategy and almost as a precursor to Magnum in some way. Shim was also part of this collective enterprise, as was, there were also times when Cartier-Bresson's work would get confused with the two of them. And then just wrapping up the pre-Magnum Foundation ICP engagements. This is Susan Meiselas' exhibition in history, which was a large retrospective that we did together. And this was 2008, so this was the exact same time that she was working on founding the Magnum Foundation, thinking about what it would become. And this exhibition was also very much embedded with history and archive through her own work. This is an image of the room where we had Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, which is a huge project she did on the 100-year photographic history of the Kurds. This was actually the same year also that the famous curator Okwe Wazer did the exhibition Archive Fever, also at ICP, looking at photographic archives. So there was something in the air about how can artists engage with photographic archives to create new work, which is something that we've carried on as sort of a central concern at the Magnum Foundation, and this is jumping ahead in time to what we're working on now. One of our core initiatives is a grant and a fellowship called Counter Histories, where we're supporting photographers to be working with archives and reframing history. And what you see on the right is an issue of Aperture magazine that we did on the topic a couple of years ago, and an exhibition. This is the work of Abdo Shanan from Algeria, who's one amazing photographer that we did. But so we've been working on this theme for the past 8 years or so, supporting artists who are engaging with history, reframing history, looking at the gaps and absences in photographic archives. There's so much that hasn't been photographed or hasn't been preserved, and why, and what kind of stories can that tell us. One of my inspirations when I was developing this idea of counter histories was Mark Seeley, who actually did a really important exhibition here at the Image Center called Human Rights, Human Wrongs. And he, at the time that I was developing this, was working on a project with Magnum about its work in Africa. And he was invited to look through the Magnum archives and think about how it had represented Africa. And he said something that struck with me, which was that the archive wasn't a history of Africa in any way. What it was a history of Western geopolitical and business interests in Africa as represented by the Western media, and that's the vestige of what you see in the Magnum archive. And so to think about, the archives show not what they're purported to be about, but who made them, under what purposes, who funded it, what were the whole mechanisms that behind its creation. And I found that a really interesting idea, and it's one that we've continued to explore in this initiative. And so we've had a series of symposia, grants, but we've also had 2 rounds of year-long fellowships, the first for 20 photographers, and I'll just let this stay for a minute so you can see some of their names, and the second for another 10. This is supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. And again, we've been able to work with these, open call both times. Both times we got over 1,200 applications for these fellowships, so there's huge interest in this, but also incredibly rich and interesting work around the world of younger, emerging photographers at all stages, actually. We had also photographer Marilyn Nance was in the first round, who's an older photographer, but revisiting an earlier body of work. But this way of working, I think it was really enriching for people, and also a way of thinking about documentary photography differently. And again, that's picking up a little bit on what Susan Meiselas has done with her work, but many other photographers as well, thinking about not only your own camera and what you can see with your own eye and your own perspective, but the many other images around that work. Susan's work in Kurdistan, in fact, started because she was sent there. She went there, was working, pictures wound up being in the New York Times in the wake of the Saddam Hussein's chemical attacks on the Kurds in northern Iraq. And when she got there, she realized, first of all, she was going in when everybody else was streaming out, and realizing, how can I tell the history of this place? There's a much bigger history here that led to this moment. And so she started digging up photo albums, historical documents to tell the larger story of this place. So I think it's an interesting prompt in documentary photography to think about what's beyond your frame that can come into the picture. So again, we supported many photographers in this, some like Agata Szymanska-Medina in Poland, who are primarily, it's a mix of her own photographs as well as archival work looking at pressure on the judiciary in Poland. This work winds up seeming kind of prescient for the US context, as does this, Alice Przanski, who was looking at her own parents' radical activism. They were in the Weather Underground in the United States. So this is her father's FBI files, which she explored and then created a book, which is a fabulous book out of this work, combined with her own photographs. So she's working with a family archive, and then this photographer, Christopher Gregory Rivera, who's also somebody we've worked with many times, from Puerto Rico, is looking at state archives and surveillance and evidence. So again, looking at how photographic archives are a record of, can be a record of state power. And so actually, I'll just play a short video by him next, and then if it comes, I think you might need to make it play. It's just showing.
Yo creo que hay mucha gente que piensa que si el gobierno los está velando, que no tienen nada que esconder. Puede ser verdad, pero mi proyecto es un testimonio al que no importa lo que tú estés haciendo, aunque sea legal, el que te estén vigilando te puede cambiar la vida. A lo largo de los últimos 10 años he estado trabajando un proyecto digitalizando y rescatando los archivos de uno de los programas continuos más largos hechos a ciudadanos americanos por su propio gobierno, que pasó en Puerto Rico. Como fotógrafos, estos objetos me interesaban por su materialidad. Las texturas son objetos que están meticulosamente hechos a mano. Entonces, como objetos son un testimonio al sistema que los creó y al gobierno que los crea. Mucha de la información es relativamente banal, cosas públicas, cosas inventadas. El retratar los objetos así como de forma de evidencia, pues hace un comentario sobre la vigilancia en sí.
So again, Chris worked on these archives of surveillance, which were collected over many decades in Puerto Rico, and a law was passed a few years ago where everybody could get their files back. So not unlike Alice's FBI files on her father, people were beginning to get back their files and see how extensive this surveillance was. And actually coming out of this project, which was an exhibition, a book, a video, there's a longer version of this video actually, which wound up circulating in film festivals and winning awards in film festivals, which was thrilling for us because we did it primarily as a sort of a trailer to get interest in his book and his project. But even more exciting, in a new project that hasn't yet been announced, you guys are the first to hear about it, so don't tell anybody. We're starting a Counter Histories Puerto Rico offshoot, and we're going to be announcing the open call for that in a couple of weeks. So in partnership with Chris, we're going to be doing 3 years of support, 10 photographers a year, looking at the lesser-known histories of Puerto Rico, photographic archives in Puerto Rico, which from the U.S. perspective, especially right now, looking at the Caribbean is super, super interesting, and thinking about the legacy of colonialism and American imperialism is a really exciting and interesting project. And also for me to see that a photographer went through one of our programs and not only made great work themselves, but thought about how can I bring this back to my community and kind of iterate it in different contexts and unearth more and more and more stories, share the learning, and extend this creative community is very exciting. So that's a little bit of a deep dive on Counter Histories, just because it's a program that's very close to my heart, and also you can see it's the one that in some ways came to mind most when I'm thinking about photographic archives, but it's one of many fellowship programs that we do. And what you're seeing here on the left is Susan with Eric Gottesman and Linda Sobekwa, who is from South Africa and was a fellow in our photography and human rights program a number of years ago, and is now a Magnum photographer and actually has work up in the MoMA New Photographies exhibition right now. So seeing that, and this is in our office. Oh, and you can see actually that's Eric Gyamfi's photograph on the wall behind, which I showed you earlier. So this is our office. So we have these fellowship programs where they're international fellowships, photographers from around the world. We used to bring everybody to New York. Now we go to different cities, both because of the difficulty of bringing people to the US right now, but also because we wanted to kind of decenter New York and be working with many of our partner organizations around the world. So last year it was in Mexico, the year before it was in Jordan. So now we move the program around. But it continues that we have these fellowships. On the right is one of our fellows, Elias Williams, who works a lot for the New York Times, taller guy, with Eli Reed, who's a Magnum photographer and on our board. So we try to also set up this intergenerational dialogue. Our most recent fellowship was called HEAT, and it was a 2-year program that was an invitation for photographers to think about environmental reporting in a different way. So to think about moving beyond the conventions of climate crisis and think about innovative new ways of telling the story, right? Because it's so critical that people understand with more nuance and with more variety what's going on with climate change. And so how can photography think differently and be brought into new spaces? So these are some of this is half of one cohort of photographers in that program. We currently have an exhibition of some of that work on view. This is our space, what it looks like right now. This is work by Farhana Satu from Bangladesh, and she's looking at the impact of persistent flooding and rising salinity on women's health in her community in Bangladesh. Oops, sorry. Another key fellowship program for us is our Arab documentary photography program, which is now in its 11th year. So this is in partnership with the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, which is based in Beirut, and the Prince Claus Fund, which is based in the Netherlands. And every year this program trains 10 photographers from the Middle East and North Africa. They come together, usually in Beirut, but sometimes when things are difficult there, they've done in Jordan or Cairo. But it's a really interesting bringing people together across the region, who many of them have said they often meet each other in Europe or in other places, but to bring people throughout the region, have a dialogue about how to subvert some of the stereotypes of reporting on that region has really contributed to foregrounding and platforming so many incredibly talented and interesting photographers from the region. There's a website for that program, which you can see on the bottom right, and you can go through and see all of the stories. And a lot of great people have come out of this program, including 3 who've gone on to be Magnum photographers. This is Miriam Boulos, whose work you might have seen, from Lebanon, Salih Bashir from Sudan on the left, and Ziad on the right. Ziad is actually currently now a mentor in that program. So again, this sort of giving back or training the next generation that's happening. So a lot of incredible talent. And that program, interestingly, was developed in the wake of Arab Spring as, again, a way of thinking about how can we subvert stereotypes of the region. And the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, which is an incredible grant-making organization that supports arts and culture in Lebanon, didn't have a photographic program, so it made a lot of sense to partner. And there are a lot of initiatives that come out of that as well. We now have an alumni fellowship program, and people who've gone through that program get support to go on and do projects beyond that, including on the left is, this is at Perry Photo, if any of you go to Perry Photo. This is a table called AK Taula, where some of the people who had been in that program do a showcase for photo books from the region, and they go to different photo festivals and showcase each other's work. And then also coming out of these fellowship programs, we provide opportunities for editorial work, for commissions, for partnerships. And so what you see here is, in the midst of COVID, we did a partnership with the Washington Post to do stories from the Middle East and North Africa of what COVID looked like there, drawing on that community that we had worked with so closely. This is in The Guardian, Shaukat Nanda from Kashmir photographing. So it was important during COVID to be giving grants and funding to photographers who were largely out of work but also couldn't travel, while also telling the stories of what was going on in their community. Shaukat was most recently one of our Counter Histories photographers, and so he's now exploring sort of hidden archival histories in Kashmir. So it's a nice opportunity for somebody who's more experienced as a newspaper photographer to have a space where he can experiment with a more creative practice. Similarly, this is a recent project that we did in partnership with the World Monuments Foundation, which dovetailed quite nicely with the Counter Histories, where they reached out to us to pair 12 of the photographers that we work with around the world with sites that they were working to preserve around the world. And this is a photograph it's actually a collage by Yael Martinez from Mexico, who also started as a Magnum Foundation fellow, is now a Magnum photographer. And this is in Teotihuacan. And this work was also shown last year in an exhibition at Perry Photo. And actually the big collage work is, again, by Eric Gyamfi, who was the first photographer that I showed. And this is an amazing project he did on Asante shrines in Ghana. And that project also had local iterations. This is a project that Victor Zea did, was in the Perry Photo Show, but he also did a local presentation of the work. This is in Peru, and he's looking at the revival of ancient water management systems as a climate resilience strategy. And he put them up around this community of Miraflores in Peru and did a walking tour. So engaging the local community, not only working in art spaces or in publications, but bringing it back to the local community. And then where I wanted to end with bringing it up to the very present, and we're thinking about how we're supporting photographers to be documenting this moment in the United States. And this is actually an earlier initiative that we did in the lead up to the 2020 election, which is a partnership with the Nation magazine called What's at Stake, where we commissioned 20 photographers to be photographing around the country, telling stories of what was going on in their communities that they felt like were going to affect the upcoming election. And we're now doing, this is also an initiative that we haven't publicized anywhere, haven't told anybody about, so you heard it here first, but we're documenting, we've been doing a lot of grant making to be supporting people around the country photographing this crisis moment in the United States. So this is Joe Rushmore, who photographed at the Charlie Kirk Memorial in Tucson, Arizona. This is Nicolo Rosso, who was photographing the ICE detentions in New York City courts, and there are a lot of people doing this work of trying to document the ICE detentions. Cynthia Santos Briones, a Mexican photographer working in America, photographing the sanctuary churches, so places where families can go to be to find safety. And then lastly, this is a new picture, hasn't been published anywhere, by Peter Van Actmel, who is both a Magnum photographer and a really key member of the Magnum Foundation board, thought partner for me. And this is a picture that he took on September 15th. This was 5 days after the killing of Charlie Kirk. It's a school group or church group visiting the Capitol building and looking up, and you see the weight of this history. And this is a painting after the end of the Mexican-American War, which is talking about American conquest and the submission of Native Americans and the part played by religion allied with force in the conquest of the New World. So I think it's this, you know, the present grappling with the past and with history and trying to figure out what it means to be photographing something that is unfolding in real time and how you support photographers to be doing that while not necessarily knowing where it's going, what stories are going to be important to history, but believing that it's important to be documenting this. And so, again, we're simultaneously trying to innovate, open up new space, experiment with new ways of storytelling, but also very firmly make sure that photographers have the funds to be out there documenting what's happening in the present. And then I'll just leave it with an image, which is sort of an invitation to come visit us. So these are all pictures from our space and hopefully give you a little bit of a sense of the community at the Magnum Foundation, which is both bringing together younger emerging photographers, and this is a little bit of a gift for Paul too, because this is his dear old friends, Jim Goldberg and the curator that he worked with for many, many years. And then on the right is Martin Parr, who came and spoke in our space recently. And again, just wanted to acknowledge these, you know, the many ways that we learn from, continue to learn and grow from the people who came before us and who broke new ground. And we try to continue in that spirit of holding space for photographers, creating community opportunities for exchange, and having faith and trust that if you support them, they'll do really interesting work. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the work that we do or anything else. Thank you for your patience and listening and turning out on this cold night. It was a pleasure to share some of this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kristen. We're going to open up the floor for questions. Can you hear me now? Okay. We're going to open up the floor for questions. I have one to kick things off, something I thought about while watching this. You mentioned at one point that one of the things that has precipitated change at the Magnum Agency is the crisis of publication. There are fewer publications that have the resources, the staff, the audience to commission new photography. And for me, it's really, really interesting that Magnum, which was, of course, and still is, an agency of photographers who are seeking publication, decided to respond to this crisis by becoming a publication source in a way, commissioning photographers, helping connect them with publications. You partner with The Guardian, I saw there. with The Nation, with Mother Jones, with other publications. You're helping photographers find an audience, which I think is really, really interesting, very noble. There was no script for it when you guys started. It's kind of amazing that you have figured out bit by bit over time how to do it and how to give photographers the opportunities that are not out there any longer in the way that they once were. And the question that I have is, essentially, how have you done that? Is it just case by case, moment by moment? You seek opportunities?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. It's kind of extraordinary to me. I'm not sure that what I would have ever thought to do in that situation, but you've essentially you've flipped Magnum's script, is how I see it in many, many
Well, yes and no. I mean, Magnum still, the agency still does all of the amazing things that it has always done and does them very well, but in a difficult environment, it's true. And what the foundation, by being a nonprofit, can do is bring in support in a different way that isn't dependent upon sales. So we're reliant largely on philanthropy, exclusively on philanthropy. So mainly foundation funding in the United States, some individuals. But really every project we do, we're pitching it to somebody, selling it. I mentioned the Henry Luce Foundation has supported a number of our initiatives, as have other foundations. But it's really about going out and making the case that this work is important and needs to be seen, and then getting the resources for it, and then connecting the dots with publications actually can be a really challenging part of it too, because when you've gotten somebody to support a body of work, you've gotten a photographer to do it, then you're still subject to all the whims of the publication. The story might get bumped for something else, or an editor might not like it, or they might want to reframe it in a way that you hadn't intended. So we don't want to only focus on publications, because I think that also, for some work that's really important, and then for other work it constrains what it can be. So, but yes, do we just figure it out as we go along? Yes, for the most part. And again, I actually kind of embrace that spirit, because I think, we never want to be a big formal institution. I do think we're an experimental space to think, how can we do documentary differently? So we have to keep moving and trying out new ideas to do that well.
And one of the things you said in your talk was that, at the very beginning of your talk was, it's impossible to sum up all of the things that you do. And it seems to me now clear why that's the case.
We just talk really fast.
You're moving fast, you're creating new modalities, you're working with new photographers, you're staying in touch with the photographers that you have worked with. And over time, that's iterative, and you accomplish a lot. But it's also sprawling and probably hard to pin down for those who want to study what you're doing. So very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I am curious if anyone has any questions for Kristen. And just please a reminder, we're going to bring you a microphone. So right over here, we'll get you a microphone, and then you can ask your question.
Thank you very much. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What got you into photography, and why documentary before the ICP? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I had a lot of friends who were photographers when I was younger, but then really, as an undergrad, I studied at the University of California, Irvine, and there was an amazing photo historian there who was actually, in the early days of photo history, there weren't that many photo historians, Sally Stein, and I took every class with her. She was a specialist in the Farm Security Administration, and so the 1930s Depression-era photography in the United States, and I became very interested in that era. And simultaneously, it was the height of the AIDS crisis in the U.S., and I think thinking about how art and activism intertwine, and how art has a chance to mobilize people around an issue, had a big influence on me too. And so I think that led my interest in, I was an art historian, and I went on to graduate school at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU and studied art history, but I always had this interest in the ways that art, activism, politics, and photography, and that sort of led into documentary photography, because in some ways it was the most about engaging with the world around us, trying to mobilize opinion, trying to change the world. My father's a social worker. That probably has something to do with it. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? We have one back there.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, like, where do you see documentary photography going in an age where truth and images are increasingly misaligned, just with AI and everything?
That is the big question. Yeah, no, that's a huge, huge question. I don't have the answer for it, but I will say that, photography has always been changing and has always been really subject to changes in technology throughout its history, and there have been many moments when people felt like this is the end of photography because of some big technological change. So that said, I don't want to undersell how profound this change is, but certainly there was talk when Photoshop came around, concern that images could be altered, and we know they were altered before that. I think it's true that this is an assault on the trust in the image that is unlike anything we've experienced before. I think, where we are now, so much of it is about reliance on the source and where you're, trusted sources. And if you know, whether that means an outlet, but also a photographer, and I think that will happen with a lot of things with AI, right? Where you don't trust the image that's detached from any context, but if it's coming from a context where you can trust it, hopefully there's still trust to be found there. But I think it's a huge, huge issue, and we're right in it. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, we have a question down here.
What's your operating budget?
Oh, wow.
Does any of your funding come from government sources, or is it all exclusively private and foundational?
That our operating budget last year was probably about 1.8 million, and that's all public information as a, again, a nonprofit. We get some public funding. The public funding from the state of New York and the city of New York is still good and supports us. We just announced today some grants from NYSCA for artists, which is the New York State Council on the Arts, and the New York City supports our public programming and some other projects in New York City. We did get NEA funding, but we no longer get NEA funding.
Any other questions? There's one right here.
Both parts of Magnum have a wonderful history of approaching conflicts around the world. Just wondering if the particularly horrible conflicts, Ukraine, Gaza right now, has it affected Magnum's approach to these? I mean, we know that in the case of Gaza, there's restrictions on access for journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Danger in Ukraine, of course, is tremendous. How is that evolving?
Huge. Well, in the case of Ukraine, actually, one of the Counter Histories projects is by an amazing Ukrainian photographer who's actually looking at the destruction of archives of Ukrainian history. Very, very important work, and we've got a couple of other folks that have been working in Ukraine that we're supporting. And in terms of Gaza, we actually, because I mentioned we have this program, the Arab Fund, the Arab Documentary Photography Program, we've been supporting photographers in the region for a long time now, including some photographers who were in Gaza. So we had the chance to see stories from within in a way that was pretty unique, and to be supporting a network of Palestinian photographers. And one of the initiatives that was done by, I showed the group AK Taula at Perry Photo, who did the publications from the region, also pulled together a zine, which you can see on our website, that brought together all of the stories from that program by Palestinians in the program. And it was not about war photography, it was about showing these long-form stories that each of them had done that showed the complexity and the range and the richness of Palestinian lives. So that was their sort of collective statement, and also was not sold, it was given away for voluntary donations, and the funds from that went to the photographers who were still in Gaza from the program.
We have time for a couple more questions. There's one up there.
Thanks so much. You mentioned that half the board are Magnum photographers. The other half, I mean, you know, what's the dynamic? What's the role and balance? You know, exactly, are they just mentors, and you know, how do they influence versus the other half? I'm not
That's
sure
such a
what
good
that.
question. Yeah. So the Magnum photographers, I shouldn't do this because I'll forget somebody, but so Susan Meiselas is the board president, and I would say she's the most active and involved. She's almost like a co-director, and we're talking all the time. So she's very, very, very involved, and that's by design and also what I want. And then there are other photographers. I mentioned that Peter Van Achtmel, who is this photographer's also been quite involved. He's sort of the younger generation, but really smart thinker about photography. He's also been a longtime mentor in our Arab documentary photography program. Not anymore, but he was for many years. So he's involved both mentoring photographers, but also kind of a thought partner, thinking about what it means to be a working photographer, trying to be out there now. So he gives us that perspective of, you know, Susan's from a different generation, so it's important to have multiple generations. Eli Reed, I mentioned, is on the board as well. Nusha Tavakolian, who's an Iranian photographer, also younger generation. Rafal Milach from Poland, also younger generation. So some of it is a mix of representing different perspectives within Magnum. All of them have sort of a firsthand experience of our programs of also mentoring, so they really know who we're serving, but can think about what does the field need, and also think about that connection to Magnum Photos and make sure that we're, you know, operating with sort of a shared set of values. And then the other people on the board are really there because they're contributing their time and expertise, you know, whether it's financial management or, you know, media, communications, et cetera. So it's people who are really rolling up their sleeves and working alongside us. So, yeah.
For our last question, there's a gentleman back here.
Thank you. You said you use archives to create new works of art, or you have people do that. I manage an archive and of my father's work, and I am always wondering, is it appropriate to create new works of art based on his work?
Oh, I love that question. Yes. I don't know. Is he still alive?
No.
Is he? Okay. I mean, part of it is this is a personal archive, so, you know, thinking about what you feel like your own personal relationship with to him is one thing. But I think that, yeah, I think that archives can be activated for another, have another life by a creative intervention. And I think they don't only have to be you know, studied or mobilized in one way by scholars. I think more creative engagement with archives, as long as you're, you know, transparent about what you're doing and whose work it is, and et cetera, I think that there's a lot of creative and interesting possibility there. So I'd love to hear more about the archive.
Whose work is it then? Like when I take one of my dad's images, I've only done this once, and I'm also a photographer, and I did what I do with my photographs to hit one of his, which is combine them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a great picture, I thought. His picture was great to start with, and then I liked what happened to it. But whose picture, is it like a co-production?
I think you should credit both of you. Call it what it is, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank
very
you so much for having me.
Before all of you leave tonight, I do want to remind everyone here that our exhibitions continue at the Image Center through April 4th. We will have additional Magnum-related events this season. For example, the nephew of Chim, Ben Schneiderman, will be here in a few weeks to speak. So I encourage you to stay up to date, keep checking our website for these events. And also, I do want to highlight a very timely related program by one of our partner organizations. Coming soon to TIFF Cinematheque is Raymond Depardon's Human Landscapes. This is curated by Andrea Picard, We've worked with her before. She's a wonderful curator. And this series of films by Raymond Depardon will run from February 28th through March 31st. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because Depardon, as many of you will probably know, is a longtime Magnum member and also co-founder of the Gamma Picture Agency. His work across film and photography is marked by deep humanism, empathy, and a profound engagement with issues of documentary and the real. The series at TIFF is really unprecedented, and it brings together newly restored titles and films that are very rarely screened. So I encourage you to check out the TIFF website and try to learn more about that program. If you do want to know more about the history of the Magnum Agency, I think that this is great good fortune for us in Toronto that is happening at the same time as our exhibitions. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great night. And again, thank you, Kristen.